We're speaking with former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt and former Interior Secretary, and we're talking about the Arizona Groundwater Management Act of 1980, something that he had a substantial hand in. Governor, thanks for talking with us here. What was the primary motivation in 1980 to enact a law managing Arizona's groundwater? Was it largely urban over-reliance on groundwater?
Doug, sometimes things have to get so bad that it's almost impossible to do anything more before, people really come together. The issue of groundwater had been, getting progressively worse for 30, 40 years. And it finally reached the point, where a variety of things had happened. Most notably, the state courts had enjoined the mines from transporting water. And I think the urban representatives were starting to see it. Their future was affected. The Interior Department was getting restless over the Central Arizona project because the project law had language saying the state promises to control its groundwater overdrafting. And those forces all came together, and it was just the whole structure was ready to collapse. And sometimes it's that kind of disaster that finally motivates people to do what perhaps they should have done much earlier. But, the table was set when I took over those negotiations.
Well, the lore of the Groundwater Act certainly is that it was a significant piece of bipartisan legislation on behalf of Arizona's government, which is something I'm going to ask you about in a second. But you brought up the feds. The feds actually did play a significant role in pushing this along, leveraging the CAP. Is that accurate to say?
Oh yeah, we negotiated. In private, outside the legislature for, I would guess more than a year. We had the great good luck of having tremendous legislative leadership in the presence of Burton Barr in the House, Stan Turley, who was then president of the Senate, and Alfredo Gutierrez, who was the Democratic leader. Really great leaders. The Interior Department was in the background for probably the first 90-95% of the negotiations. But as we reached an impasse, I contacted C. Sanders, who was then the secretary, and said, we need to get the Interior Department suited up and into the game. And I kind of made a deal with him. I said, see, you got to threaten to cancel the Central Arizona project in order to motivate people to get going. And I said, of course, I will deny that I ever asked you to do it, and I will condemn you for, overarching federal interference. But it worked. He came to Arizona and read the Riot Act, and it motivated people, and we managed to kind of cross the last 10 yards as a result of that.
That's marvelous inside baseball. But this was, in the end, a bipartisan act. How did a Democratic governor get conservative Republican legislators to buy into this?
Well, bear in mind that the legislature had failed again and again over the preceding decade. They put up groundwater study commissions, various kinds of groups, and they'd actually been unable to do anything. And the leadership agreed at that point that we would take a really unusual step, which is take it entirely out of the legislative process and set up a negotiation behind closed doors with the interest groups, the mines, the cities, and agriculture. And the legislature would basically stay out of it, except for the participation of Stan Turley, who reported back to the Republican leadership that, we were making progress. And remarkably, once we had drafted the bill, several hundred pages, I called a special session of the legislature in June of that year. The bill was introduced and passed in one day with no amendments and virtually no debate. Now, I suppose, people who worry about process and open meetings and transparency would say that was, hardly the way to pass a law. But the times demanded it. I mean, it was an urgent issue, and in the context of what had to be done, I think the members of the legislature just stood aside, and we got it done.
And a remarkable accomplishment. Now, the law excludes rural counties of Arizona in large part. Why was that the case? Why did that happen?
Yeah, that's an important line that was drawn. The basic issue is that it was the big desert groundwater basins in Maricopa, Pinal, and Pima County where the problem was, because on top of those basins is 98% of Arizona's irrigated agriculture and Phoenix and Tucson. That was the urgent issue. Looking across the rest of the state, we basically said, we can't deal with everything at once. There's still time in the future to think about it. But that time has now passed. It's been, let's see, 30 years have passed. And that puts us in front of one of the next big challenges is we really need to have a legislative framework for managing groundwater in the rest of the state. I think the framework could be quite different because the issues in rural Arizona are, there's a lot of groundwater up there. There's no crisis in most of the areas, but there will be. And the big issue in the rest of the state, I think, is how do you manage water and groundwater so that you don't dry up the surface resource. What we see in the rest of the state is this close connection between the surface hydrology, the streams that are so important for recreation and for many other purposes. They're closely connected to the groundwater, and we need to recognize that connection, which is sort of a dominant idea, whether you're on the San Pedro, the Verde, Oak Creek, the Upper Salt River, and formulate a law that speaks to that. It would be quite different from the groundwater law of 1980 because it's dealing with a different problem. But that's an important issue, and it's time to get on with it.
Yes. Now that is what many people see as a flaw in the law as it regards to urban use of water. In the rural areas, it's a much simpler issue at this point, isn't it? I mean, since there isn't even so much as metering of groundwater use. That's a reform that's necessary, I think.
Yeah, we're dealing with this in California and other states right now. You can't manage water without knowing how it's being used. And we now have well measuring technology that is simple, relatively inexpensive, and we ought to have a statewide provision which says that all water withdrawals, above a few gallons per minute, all of them must be metered and reported. It's done under the Groundwater Management Act of 1980 in the 3 urban counties. But it ought to be done statewide.
Okay. Listen, I'd like to get back to a historical question, if I could, regarding CAP. I sort of asked this before, but obviously the construction of the CAP system was critical to urban Arizona weaning itself from over-reliance on groundwater. Is the CAP essential to making the 1980 law work? And if so, how does it work in rural areas then?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The whole premise of the groundwater law was that it would push cities and agriculture toward using the Colorado River water supply. Now, we're into a drought period, and there's going to be a big discussion about how much CAP water there's really going to be. And there's no question that our predecessors in Arizona, starting with Governor Hunt back at the turn of the century and going all the way up for decades, up into the 40s and 50s and 60s, Arizona kind of took this, it's us against the world. The enemy is California. We're not going to cooperate. It's a zero-sum game. We paid a huge price for that because again and again and again, Arizona refused to negotiate, refused to cooperate, and basically lost and finally had the CAP supply subordinated to California. But that's all ancient history. But the lesson from that intransigence and the failure of our political leaders back in those days is that cooperation is now the name of the game. And I think that's finally starting to sink in. And I think the CAWCD and the Department of Water Resources are doing that in these shortage negotiations on Lake Mead. Really important. We should not be waving the bloody shirt and blaming California and Nevada. We've got to work with them. And I'm really pleased to see that that's now happening.